Hi. In preparation for today's video, I went through the house to pick out the few Bibles that I could right off the bat. Most American homes have several of them, and so do we. This is my dad's King James Family Bible. This Bible was my wife's Revised Standard Version, and this one's not even in print anymore. This is my old study Bible. This is a Serendipity Bible. This is my minister's Bible. This one is very old, but it's got 4 versions in one. You know, for a new Christian to walk into a bookstore or a Christian bookstore, they'll sit and be faced with shelf after shelf after shelf of Bibles. It's like a tidal wave of information. How do you pick the one that you need or you want? How do you know which one to pick? Well, that's what this video is about. To explain that, there are 2 main elements that were involved in creating multiple versions. One is our history, and that's what I'll talk about today in this video. And the other one is the nature of language and translation. I'll talk about that one a little bit later. I want to start with talking about the history of the Bible, because the history, what something becomes is dependent upon what it has been. And that's certainly the case when we deal with the Bible. First thing you've got to understand about all of these Bibles, every English Bible you will ever run across is a translation. The original Bible was written in Greek, Hebrew, and some Aramaic. In around 400 AD, a certain scholar named St. Jerome was commissioned to translate those original 3 languages into a particular version for the Latin people. This version became the Latin Vulgate. What's interesting is the word Vulgate is actually where we get the root word vulgar. Means the common people. And in fact, St. Jerome was tasked to create this Bible so that the common people would be able to read the Bible in their own language. There's a funny thing that happens, though. As people get used to a particular way things are said, or they get used to a particular language that it's written in, they never want to change. They get totally upset when they're dealing with someone changing these now sacred words as opposed to the sacred thoughts. So, as Latin began to disappear, the people that had created the Bible began to hide it in that dead language. It wasn't that hard to do, really. Understand, the printing press didn't happen until the 1450s. So we're talking about nearly 1,000 years. During that time, the only way you could get a copy of the Bible would be to copy it yourself, and most people were illiterate, so they'd have to hire a scribe to do it, and that would be paying a person's salary for about 1 year. What did that mean? In reality, a copy of the Scriptures cost about $30,000 by today's standards. That's about 1 year's salary. But the other problem was related to corruption. You see, where anything good exists, bad things start to happen. Corruption is a little bit like rot on good meat. It's going to happen, and it's going to eventually destroy the good meat. And it doesn't matter how much more good meat you put with it, the corruption will simply consume it. And that happened to the Catholic Church. The Catholic means universal. And originally, there were probably 2 or 3 different churches across the globe. The Roman Catholic Church became the Western Church. Then you have the Orthodox churches that were the Eastern churches. In any case, as Scripture became less common and people's ability to read it became less evident, the popes began to do things that were not scriptural. There's a pope that was quoted somewhere around 800 to 1000 AD as saying, if the people ever get the Scriptures and find out what we've been doing, we will be in a lot of trouble. Well, the Reformation is based exactly on that. It really started for our English Bible around 1380. That's when a man named John Wycliffe completed a handwritten copy and translation of the Latin Vulgate into English. As you can see, it's something that neither you nor I would be able to easily read. The language has changed so much since the 1380s when this was written. The standardization of spelling and of sentence structure wouldn't be done really until about 1803 when Noah Webster would create his dictionary. So spelling was a free form, and there was such a mix of languages that no one knew exactly how to spell. John Wycliffe did do one thing that was very, very significant. He, like St. Jerome before him, insisted on the scriptures being translated into the common people's language. He felt like it was the right of every human being to have the scriptures for themselves. This became the foundational thought behind the Pilgrims and behind the Puritans and really modern day conservative Christianity. We believe in the right and ability of people to read the scriptures for themselves and to learn what God has to say for themselves, with no intercessors, no priest to stand between them. Well, John Wycliffe led a very interesting life because it was illegal to translate scriptures. But he inspired other men such as John Huss, who became one of the great martyrs of Christian history. The Catholic Church in its corruption began to kill Christians, and they were very successful with it. Finally, in 1450, we have one of the great technological innovations of our day, almost equal to the wheel, the movable type printing press. What this meant was you could spend a day or a few hours assembling a page. And then you could print thousands and thousands of pages. There was no end to how many of them you could print. And then you could create another page and do the whole thing over again. By the way, a little side note, the reason why we have columns in our Bible is because it was easier to reassemble columns than it was to reassemble an entire page. So next time you look at a Bible and see those columns, you can understand that it dates back to the 1450s that was done. People do not like change, and that's a lot of the story that you have to deal with when you talk about versions. Then in 1525 to 1526, thereabout, a man named William Tyndale began to translate the original Greek and Hebrew, unlike John Wycliffe, who translated the translation, the Latin Vulgate. William Tyndale got through the New Testament and actually did a second edition of it, and was about a third of the way through the Old Testament when, after he fled to Germany, he was betrayed by a friend, turned over to the Roman Catholic Church, and finally in 1536 he was strangled to death before being burned at the stake. They were determined to kill him. But the translation work that he did was of such high quality that in 1560, in other words, about, what would that be, about 24 years later, one of the first English translations, complete Bible, was put together. This involved a group of scholars, and they looked at Tyndale's work, and Tyndale's work was so good that about 90% of Tyndale's work ended up in this new version of the Bible. The new version was the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible was actually the most popular English Bible until many decades after the King James came out. It's actually the Bible of the Puritans and of the Pilgrims. And about 90% of it ended up in the King James. It was an excellent work. Then they finished publishing it. The last publication of it was in 1644. But back in England, and they had allowed for some reprints of the Geneva Bible in England, there arose a certain king by the name of James I. King James was a scoundrel. He does not deserve the honor that he gets for his name on the Bible. He was determined to stick a finger in the eye, if you wish, of the Pope. He was determined to show that the Anglican Church, which had rebelled and risen away from Rome, was every bit as powerful and capable, and he authorized them to translate the scriptures into English. Hence the name, the Authorized Version. It also became the Standard Version, and today we really refer to it as the King James Version, KJV. It was not, although it went in 1622, went with the Pilgrims to America, understand they were still reading and enjoying the Geneva Bible. But eventually, as the Geneva Bible stopped publication, and as fewer and fewer copies were out there, it began to fade, and people began to turn to the King James, and they found that it was a good and reliable version. A little subnote of history, something that people don't necessarily like to hear about, is the issue of revisions on the King James. The King James Bible had 4 different editions that were put out, or revisions. And the last one, the one that we tend to use here in America, is the 1769 Baskerville edition. The 1769 Baskerville edition has the current spellings and current sentence structure and the current choice of wording that we use now. It's worth noting, if you look at the foreword of the King James Bible, that the original translators realized it was going to have to be modified as new information came out. A new texts were discovered, and people would be doing comparisons and figuring out what exactly was right and what exactly was wrong. But for those who are hung on the King James, that does not matter. All that matters is that this is the inspired version. It's the one that stood the test of time. It's in a dead language and hard to read. But we don't care because it's the inspired translation. Right now I'm going to tell you straight out. The one version I do not recommend to new Christians is the King James Version. It's very popular. It's very cheap because the text is already paid for a long time ago. But it's extremely difficult for 21st century English speakers to read. And because of that, one of the admonitions in the Bible, and all of your get understanding, is impossible unless you're very comfortable reading Shakespeare or other pieces of works from 1611 or that time frame. But it was truly an amazing version. And it was so hard fought for that the people literally froze language for nearly 250 years, trying to keep it from changing so they could always go back and read it like they would talk every day. But the Enlightenment came along. And before long, you had people who were exploring new philosophies and new doctrines, and new words were added to the English language. And not only that, but even our structure began to change as we had more and more of a mix of different cultures and different beliefs and different ideals. And so it finally became important to create one more revision. In 1881, several years after Noah Webster's dictionary, which a lot of its spelling was probably based off the King James, the Anglican Church decided it was time to give another revision to the Standard Version. And that revision is called the Revised Standard Version. Isn't that amazing? Truth is that the people who had gotten used to the wording of the King James could not accept such a drastic change. So they actually turned it into a different version. The Americans, being Americans, said, well, we won't take the Anglican version, so they created an almost duplicate version called the American Standard. The American Standard is interesting because in 1971, it was completely reworked and updated to modern language and became the New American Standard. Today, still considered one of the finest word-for-word translations of the scriptures that exist. What's word for word? It means it matches as closely as possible the Greek and Hebrew of the original languages. I will talk more about that in the next video. In any case, finally that was in 1973, there was a team of scholars assembled from across the world. And they decided that their contribution would be to create a version that was as readable as possible, but would still stay true to the original language. And they came up with the New International Version from international scholars. The New International Version was started in 1973. That's when the New Testament was published. At the time, I was actually using the New American Standard, and then in 1978, the entire NIV Bible came out. NIV for New International Version. That has been my Bible ever since. People have often said I've got a great deal of Bible knowledge, and I think I do. But a lot of that is because I've always chosen to read the Bible in a language, in a way that I can understand. The NIV itself has had 3 revisions. The latest one people have some fits with. Again, in the next video, I'll talk a little bit about that. But at this point, I still think it's an extremely trustworthy version. Finally, around 2002, a group of scholars got together and decided that they want to try to create a version that would have more exact copying of the word for word, but still be as readable as the NIV. And they came up with the English Standard Version, the ESV. The English Standard Version is a very good translation used by many, many churches. There are several others that are out there, the Holman Christian Standard, and others that have tried to find that same balance between what is word for word accurate and thought for thought understandable. When I talk about languages and the nature of languages in the video that's yet to come, you'll see what I mean about how hard it is to balance these two. In any case, that attempt was made in 2002, and they succeeded in creating the English Standard Version. A quick note before I get done here. People will ask, well, what versions do you really recommend? If you want close to word for word, the New American Standard or the English Standard Version is very good. That's for anyone who's wanting to study the words and the sentence structure and the nature of the original text as much as possible. For the compromise in between, the Holman Christian Standard and the New International Version are tremendous. And then for those who are more simply read, the New Reader's Version or the New Living Translation is more thought for thought as opposed to word for word. These versions are all reliable and good, and there are some bad versions, but they're actually fairly rare. You won't find them in a common bookstore. In any case, that is the history of our English Bible. I trust that God will be with you until we can meet again. Thank you.